When we draw stuff, we like it when stuff is three-dimensional, and another way to make us believe that this cube is 3D is by applying some lights and shadows. But if you apply shading the wrong way, it might even look worse than before. I started by digging up information on what my blurry mind could remember, and I watched a bunch of videos as well. And as always, I've never been to an art school. I'm not exactly an expert. These are just my personal notes. Please just use my videos as tips and not as a full detailed guide. So what are shadows exactly? I dug up some information on lights and shadows. The most simple explanation would be, it's an area where light is not present or is being blocked off. Yeah, that's about it, but what is light then? Light, visible light or visible radiation is electromagnetic radiation that can be perceived by the human eye. Yeah, okay, well, I don't think we need to dig that deep to just draw it, you know? There are 7 things that I'm going to cover, and let me be clear, I am doing it in this order because this is the order that I usually go through when I draw something. And I'm gonna turn this panel into this. Firstly, we start off by figuring out the light source, what direction it's coming from, and how many light sources there are. We're just gonna stick with one light source for this panel. After defining the light source, we can now separate the areas that are in light and the areas that are in the shadow. We're gonna label these as the light family and the shadow family. We'll get into that later. And of course, objects will block the light like I said earlier, and it'll cast a shadow according to the shape of the object. Usually the closer the object is to the light source, or the further away they are from the surface that the shadow is cast upon, the more blurry the cast shadow becomes. There is something more that I would like to note regarding cast shadows. Let's say we have a cylinder here, and a light source directly from above. We already know that one side is going to be in light and the other one is going to be in the dark. If we block off some of this light though with a plate, you might think the shadows will overlap, because it's less light after all, right? Not necessarily. The shadows will actually still somewhat remain the same amount of darkness as before. We can see Makobuchi here hovering his hand over the ball, but the shadow on the ball isn't becoming that much darker, or at least not as much as you might expect it to. Yes, there will be dark areas in shadow areas. We'll get into that later. Now for the midtones. Remember when we split up the light and the shadow family? The midtones will be in the light family. The midtones are basically when the light is transitioning into the shadow. There is something called Lambert cosine's law, which is basically how bright a surface will be depending on the angle that it's facing the light source. At a 0-degree angle, the brightness is at 100%, and at a 90-degree angle, the brightness will be at 0%. But keep in mind that the brightness progression is not linear. Here's a scale that Program made, and also a graph as well. I'm not gonna spend time setting up a graph and stuff myself, I'm just here to take notes, okay? If an area has less light, it's likely gonna be less bright. This is usually the case for occlusion shadows. When the surfaces are brought close together, since not a lot of light can get in between there, you know, there's gonna be less light. The core shadow follows the same principle, less light, less bright. I usually don't really paint in the core shadow, it just kinda happens automatically if I add in reflective or ambient light. Let's talk about light. Warning, we are getting into areas where I'm more likely to be a bit inaccurate regarding the physics. There is something called the albedo effect. It basically just describes how different surface reflects and absorbs the light and radiation. When light hits the surface, it usually gets reflected or absorbed. In this example, the light will hit the ground, and the ground will then reflect the light and make it bounce back onto the ball, lighting it up a bit. But how much light being reflected will depend on how reflective the surface is. Brighter surfaces will reflect more light, which is why people wear white in the desert, and dark surfaces on the other hand will then absorb more light, which is why wearing black clothing during a hot summer is not recommended. If you already knew about this, good. Well, depends on your education system, I guess. Now apply to your art. And I'm just gonna put ambient light here as well, cause I usually do it at the same time. It's basically just light from the environment. Most of the time it's just light reflecting off the environment. It can also just be the color of the light source, like the blue color caused by the sky in this picture of Walter White. Okay, the sky isn't actually a light source, it's the sunlight going through the atmosphere. Some shit happens and it comes as a blue light. We love subsurface scattering here. also known as SSS cause it looks pretty. So the way it works, when light hits the surface, it might penetrate it, and then the light will reflect and bounce on the inside, basically lighting it up from the inside. This will then in turn cause this glowing effect, usually on the edge here. For the case of humans, the light penetrates the skin, and a lot of it will bounce off our red blood cells, which is what causes this reddish glow you see. Subsurface scattering can happen on anything that's translucent, like biological tissue or even ice. 2 AM in the core here. I forgot to mention, so if you ever see this and think, wait a minute, this object doesn't have red blood cells, why does it have something that kinda looks like red subsurface scattering on skin? That's because this isn't subsurface scattering. A shadow that's saturated with a color like this is based on realism, but this is something called light falloff, and it's not SSS. Light falloff is when the light source is further away. The light will 1, of course, become darker, 2, become more saturated, and 3, it will shift the hue a bit. Sometimes artists like to saturate the light falloff a bit. Marco Pucci made a good video about this. The highlights are basically just the brightest area of the light family. I like to add the hard highlights at the end, like on the hair or the little one on the eye, you know. And to summarize everything here, I start off with the base colors, and then I do the first layer of shadows, simply by marking out what's in light and what's not in light. I then start doing the darker areas within the shadows, like the occlusion shadows. After that, I do the environmental lighting, like the reflective light and the ambient light. Then I add the subsurface scattering. And then I finish it off with the strong highlights. Then I also add a few little things that doesn't necessarily make sense just cause it looks nice. You know, a bit of stylization. And yeah, that's basically how I do a lighting. I could do a video on stylization since a lot of you seem to like my style for some reason. Did I learn anything new? I learned some of the sky scattering stuff, and I got a bit better understanding of subsurface scattering, I guess. I wouldn't say I had a huge improvement. We're starting to move into areas of this journey where I likely won't learn as many new things. It's still improvement nonetheless. Alright, bye bye everyone. I'll try streaming on Twitch, I guess, and check out my Discord. I made 13 random people make it. Go check it out. Can we say